Welcome, friends, to your first series of podcasts. This series consists of 4 podcasts on the YouTube channel on animal behavior. It's our first unit in AP Biology this year. We will hit this first when we come in September, do a few labs, so it's important for you to get this information over the summer so we can hit the ground running in the fall. That said, let's go on and talk a little bit about this topic. We're going to have, as I said, 4 podcasts on animal behavior. This first one is going to be just basically an introduction to what we mean when we talk about animal behavior. And talk about it, we do. We talk about it all the time. We're animals, we behave. We talk about what could cause it. Why does somebody behave this way? And so, of course, we can extrapolate these ideas out to animals in general. All animals behave, not just the human ones. Behavior then. What is animal behavior? What an animal does and how it does it. Pretty straightforward. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure what that means. We can also think about it as response to stimulus in an animal's environment. How do they respond to a particular stimuli, to something happening in their environment? Here, obviously, the dog makes the cat have a particular response. Okay? That's the kind of thing you need to keep in mind. What's causing a behavior? Why does an animal do this? And what does the animal do? All of those things are behavioral type questions. Okay? Now, what is the cause of animal behavior, or various behaviors we see animals do? And there's a debate that's gone on forever, and I'm sure it will go on for a long time to come. Is it nature or is it nurture? Another way of thinking about that, is it genes? Is it just part of our physical makeup? Is the way we behave programmed in us? Is it just hardwired in our DNA and in our bodies physically? Or does our behavior more come from our environment, what we are exposed to, what we learn as from the things that we see? I think as humans, we like to think that we have free will, that we have choice, that we choose to behave one way or we choose to behave another way. We like that self-determination, and we also like to be able to blame other people for their bad choices sometimes. But in reality, genes do play a role in the way we behave. For example, you are programmed to learn language. It is part of your genes as a human being that your brain works such that you learn language. Now, what language you learn, French, English, pretty much depends on where you grow up, but and that would be your environment. So you can see that these two things actually overlap quite a bit. Really, then it's a kind of a false argument. Is it nature or is it nurture? Is it genes or is it the environment that causes our behavior to be whatever it is, or any animal's behavior to be whatever it is? In fact, they both play a role. There are genetic components to behavior that are indeed very hardwired. They are part of the way our brains work, our bodies work. And there are other things that we pick up because we learn them. Okay, so really it is a matter of degree always when we're talking about animal behavior. Okay, now there are 2 main types of behavior that we will talk about as part of this unit. The first type are innate behaviors. Innate means instinctual, if you will. It is the inherited. If you want to think of this as the nature part of the nature versus nurture argument, or the genes part of the genes versus environment argument, innate behaviors, we don't have to learn them. They are hardwired into us. We are born with them. For example, this little doggy down here is hardwired to take care of her puppies. It is instinctual. She just does that. She gives birth. She starts nursing. That's hardwired. It is automatic. It is consistent. And it is fixed. Fixed behavior that is not likely to be modified by any kind of outside environmental influence. She is hardwired to do that. Those are innate behaviors. However, the other type of behavior is learned behavior. Okay? Learned behaviors are much more varied. They are flexible depending on what you are exposed to. Certain animals may learn one thing, certain animals may learn another. If you look, this little chimpanzee has learned how to do a pretty nifty trick. He's learned how to take this stick and use it as a tool to get at some insects in a tree. But another chimpanzee that was exposed to some other type of behavior might learn something differently. It allows for great flexibility in terms of an animal adapting to a specific situation, being able to handle problems as they arise, changes in their environment as they arise. These learned behaviors we have can change over time and develop as we encounter new and different situations. Again, though, we've got to remember that innate behavior and learned behavior, there is really important overlap. I mean, consider it. Our ability to learn is innate in us. Human beings are hardwired this way. So are many other animals hardwired such that learning can occur. But what you learn, obviously, is learned. Again, going back to the language example, your ability to learn language is hardwired. What language you learn, that's a learned behavior. Okay? Now, this is an important question and an important concept. Can behavior, animal behavior, be studied in terms of natural selection? Obviously, before we answer this question, we need to make sure that everyone is on the same page and knows what this idea of natural selection means. Natural selection, you may remember from first-year biology, is a foundational concept in the idea of evolutionary biology, and we will talk much more about that as we get into the course. But right now I want you to kind of forget about the large picture evolution. We're going to just talk about what natural selection means right now. Natural selection is the idea that the environment favors or selects organisms that are best adapted to it. For example, if I'm a frog living in a very lush green tropical forest, then I am going to survive better. I'm going to survive more often. I'm going to avoid being eaten more of the time if I'm green. If I am bright red, then I might get eaten, unless I'm poisonous, and then that's a whole nother story. But assuming that I'm not poisonous, if I'm bright red, I would stand out, I would get eaten. So natural selection would favor me, would allow me to survive if I blended in well to my environment. And if I survive, what's important that I do is if I survive, then I get to reproduce. And I make more babies that have my very, very good traits, my adaptation of the green coloration. And so there will be even more green frogs left behind after I'm gone because I will have succeeded, I will have reproduced many times and passed on my genes. Remember, it's my genes that determined to make me green in the first place. So my genes were really good. I got the green coloration in my genes, which allowed me to survive, and that's okay, but what's really important is that I'm allowed to reproduce and have my genes passed on to my offspring that were very helpful to me. They're also going to be very helpful to my offspring. They'll make more offspring and so on. Whereas a poor little red frog, he's not going to make it because he's going to be eaten, and he will not survive very long. He certainly won't get to reproduce as much as I would do as a green frog, and so his red genes don't get passed on. So over time, green frogs are much more common in the environment. That's the idea of natural selection. Again, we'll talk about it much more. Now, can behavior be studied in terms of natural selection? Can certain behaviors be favored by an environment, for example? Well, if genes play a role in determining an animal's behavior, then if that behavior allows them to survive and, more importantly, reproduce, then natural selection can act on that behavior. So the answer is a big resounding yes. Okay? Many, many aspects of behavior, of animal behaviors, are determined by genes. We've already talked about certain innate behaviors. They are hardwired. They are determined by your genes, your DNA. Okay? Those genes create some behavior that is part of the organism's phenotype. Okay? They create neural pathways in the brain. The brain is a physical organ. There are certain behaviors that are hardwired into an animal's brain. And that behavior, however they act, becomes part of its phenotype. This is a genetics word, by the way. It just means, if you'll recall, pH, phenophysical appearance. Okay? So, natural selection acts on phenotypes. In other words, the green frog example, it acted on whether I was green or red. If I was green, I blended into the trees and I got to live. If I was red, I didn't blend in and I got eaten. Okay? So, this leads to greater fitness in the organisms that inherit whatever trait, which leads to, as we already said, better survival. And ultimately, if we survive, we can make more babies. And reproductive success, making more babies that share our good traits, is what it's all about. So, if our behaviors that are hardwired in our genes, if our behaviors enhance our ability to survive and have offspring that also survive well, then natural selection will favor those traits. Okay? So, we now, in modern biology, which really began midway or earlier in the last century, studying animal behavior used to be just what is this animal doing, and describing what the animal was doing without really concentrating on why. But now with this idea of evolution and of natural selection, and actually let me just replace this term for a moment, natural selection in mind, okay, that the environment favors behaviors, characteristics that allow an organism to survive and reproduce. Okay? Keeping that in mind with behaviors now lets us understand why an organism is doing certain things. It must help it survive. If that bird is singing out there, why? Well, that singing must help it somehow survive or have offspring. How does that happen? It allows us a lot more insight into why animals do certain things. It must help them survive. It must help them have offspring, because that is what natural selection favors. Okay, so this is just saying what I just said. In the past, animal behavior has been limited to just the most basic of questions. What's the animal doing? How is it doing it? What's the animal doing? The bird is singing. How is the animal doing it? Well, he's got an organ in his throat and so on that allows him to make these complex sounds. But if we think about natural selection involved in this idea, then we can probe this much more deeply. We can say, why is that bird singing? Why would natural selection favor that behavior? And we can really start to probe these ideas of animal behavior after that. So, there are a couple of kinds of questions that we ask based on this. The more typical type of question before behavioral biologists started applying natural selection to animal behavior were proximate questions, meaning proximate means near, meaning more ready type answers. How and what? What's the bird doing? How is it doing it? Immediate question. What's the stimulus? What's the response? Very obvious question. So in the case of the bird, what triggers his singing? Well, there's some other bird nearby. How is he able to sing? He has a syrinx in his throat that allows him to pass air over it and make multiple complex sounds and so on. These are kind of flat questions. They don't really probe in depth too much into the whys. The questions that most biology centers on now with regard to animal behavior are termed ultimate questions. What is the ultimate reason that a bird sings? Why? What is the point? What is the behavior's evolutionary significance, or its significance in terms of natural selection? Why did this behavior allow him to survive? Why is it being selected for? Okay? How does the behavior contribute to survival? And more importantly, this is always extremely important, reproductive fitness. How does the behavior allow this bird to make more babies than if he didn't do the behavior? Another great term, adaptive value. Why is this a good adaptation to have, which is anything that basically leads to reproductive fitness. So these are the why type questions, and this is what we really do try to focus on. So why does the bird sing? Not just what's the trigger, how does he mechanically do it, but why does he do it? Okay, ethology is the study of behavior. It began back in the 30s, and there were several pioneers who contributed to linking this animal behavior science, to actually natural selection, leading to these bigger, deeper questions. For example, and you don't need to know, there's one name you might want to know. This guy and this guy, not so much, but this guy is a pretty big name in animal behavior. They all are big names, but as far as what you would need to know, not so much. Konrad Lorenz, you might want to remember this guy. He's pretty well known, but Karl von Frisch, he studied bee communication. You may have heard of bee dances. A bee will go out into the neighborhood and find a good source of nectar, and she will come back to the hive, and by doing a complex dance, be able to tell other bees exactly where these flowers are. It's pretty amazing. This gentleman, Nico Tinbergen, kind of developed this idea of proximate versus ultimate, bringing in the whole idea of natural selection into the study of behavior. And Konrad Lorenz did some huge studies on imprinting with geese, and we'll talk at length about some of those. Okay, now, as we already said, we got two types of behavior we're going to be looking at: innate and learned. Okay? So why aren't all behaviors just learned, or why aren't they all innate? What's the advantages to each of these two major types of behaviors? There's advantages to both. Okay? So the adaptive value of innate behaviors is that they are innate. In other words, they are automatic. They are built in. They are not going to change. You don't have to learn them. They are just there. And that really, really helps with early survival when you haven't had time to learn anything yet. You can just respond. You just respond in a way that natural selection is deemed as most often the time going to let you survive in a particular situation. Okay? An organism is going to have this behavior whether or not they've been taught it by others. So despite wherever you are, different environments, conditions, influences, all individuals will exhibit this beneficial behavior. You're not going to be dependent on others to teach you the behavior. It's just programmed. So you don't have to learn it. It's ready from the time you're able to function at birth. That is a very big advantage to that kind of behavior. Okay? So what about learned behavior? Why is that useful? Obviously, learned behaviors are not going to help you when you're just born because you haven't had time to learn anything yet. But once you have had some experiences, learned behaviors aren't stuck. They aren't rigid. If some behavior you have learned turns out not to be the best, you can modify it by your own experience. If a certain way of obtaining food isn't working for you, you learned it from your mother, you can modify it based on your own experience. You can watch others that are more successful and learn from them. It is variable. It is changeable. If you are an animal living in a complex, changing environment, as almost all animals do, then such a behavior is going to be a huge asset to you because you can respond to the complexity of your environment. You aren't locked into some rigid, repeated, stupid response to a changing situation. You can modify your response. Huge adaptation. All right, so that's our basic introduction to animal behavior, and we will have 3 more podcasts focusing on other aspects or expanding on some of these aspects of animal behavior that we've been talking about. Okay, so that's it. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next podcast.